Now let's keep going. If you recall a little bit earlier, I brought up the man Samuel Lee from Cambridge, England, living in the 19th century. A man who, according to his daughter, here's a quote, he became convinced that the views which he entertained, known as the Preterist, were those held by the early church. The translator of Calvin's materials said that he is unrivaled. No scholar of our age can approach him. Just a wonderful endorsement of this man's level of not only theological training, but just general scholarship all the way around. And here's a quote from Samuel I'd like to give. He writes, "Add to this, the book of Revelation's own repeated declarations that what was then said was shortly to come to pass, and we should be led to a conclusion as strong as words and facts can make it, that the purposes of God, as declared by the prophets and generally summed up in this book, have been long ago fulfilled and finished." Just a wonderful statement, with a preterist view of prophecy, looking back to the fulfillment of prophecy without looking forward to it, which would be generally considered a futurist point of view. And so Samuel Lee is a very relevant man theologically, but I just like the guy for who he is. He just seems like a really great fella. Here's a quote from him elsewhere. "We cannot humble ourselves too much. We cannot love Christ too much. We cannot depend too much upon him, nor cast our cares too implicitly and fully upon him. Nor indeed can we rejoice too much in his power, readiness, and willingness to save to the uttermost." Just a wonderful statement affirming his focus on the Lord Jesus Christ, and just kind of affirming the nature of this man besides his scholarship. I'd like to give a quote that is from Charles Darwin that was in his memoirs that were discovered after his death. This is from May 16th, 1832. "I find him, Dr. Lee, a very pleasant chatting man and in high spirits like a boy. He seemed perfectly happy." And that was from a dinner that Darwin and Lee had together. So just an interesting connection there. Anyway, the great work that Lee was able to discover and translate and publish was the Divine Manifestation of Christ by Eusebius, or the Theophany, or Theophaneia, depending upon the language we're looking at. And this fellow was the Bishop of Caesarea. He lived from 265 to 340. He was living in one of the most critical moments in the history of Christianity, when the Roman Empire converted to Christ en masse as a matter of law. And in this work, which was dated by hand to 411, this manuscript, but which dates to about 310, it was remarkable in that, like I mentioned, there's no sense of a futurity for the fulfillment of Christ's second coming or a kingdom that will break in. He actually saw these things as accomplished contemporarily with the events that he saw in his day, and even comes across in this work as really a completely fulfilled type of eschatology. But I don't want to seem as though I'm mischaracterizing this man or his theology, because he was certainly no full preterist. He was a very strong preteristic theologian, in that there was a great degree of fulfillment in his thought and in his writings. But even though there wasn't any look towards future fulfillment in this particular book, there are others where he does make reference to, especially as the Catholic type of power started to be consolidated by him and Constantine together, that there was, in fact, something to be seen in the future. And so even though there's no mention of future fulfillment in this particular book, it's not really precise, I guess, to call it a modern or a full preterist book. If we went by that standard, then I suppose we could say the same thing about the Emancipation Proclamation or anything like that. And so we just want to make it clear that Eusebius was not a full preterist. But what's interesting is Samuel Lee's relationship with Lee, especially with the publishing of this work to the general scholarly world. And keep in mind that this is a work that had been lost to the Western world for maybe 1,000 years, or even more potentially. There was only one ancient reference to it by Jerome, which wasn't very long in the lives of illustrious men. And so the anticipation for the reception of this work was immense in the scholarly world, especially in England and in Europe at large. And so Lee, taking the opportunity to publish this book, which he did in 2 languages, also took it upon himself to provide a preliminary dissertation to the work itself, a kind of an introduction or an extended introduction to the work where he laid out what he believed was the importance of it. Most importantly, in that this work settled what was a long-standing controversy regarding Eusebius's view of the divinity of Christ in the issue of what is known as Arianism. That there had been some number of charges through the years that Eusebius was actually an Arian, and if you want to study up on that, you can check out on the internet. But this work settles once and for all that indeed he was not. So for the sake of his, call it orthodoxy or his reputation, the publishing of this work was quite important. And that was part of the preliminary dissertation that Lee provided with this book. But he also did more. And here's a quote from that dissertation that shows how bold Samuel Lee was as a scholar and as a man. As he writes, "It is evident that Eusebius believed that the end had come. And in this, there can be no doubt, I think, he was right. But as this involves a question very ill understood at this day, it may be right to offer a few words here as to what is meant by the end." And it was more than a few words, by the way. It was dozens and dozens of pages outlining a systematic preterist point of view that saw all prophecy fulfilled associated with the coming of the end here. And I'd like to read a quote from this preliminary dissertation as well as he deals with that subject. And he writes, "The old and elementary system passed away with a great noise, and these predicted empires have actually fallen. And the new kingdom, the new heaven and earth, the new Jerusalem, all of which were to descend from God, to be formed by his power, have been realized on earth. All these things have been done in the sight of all the nations." And this is his preliminary dissertation, available online or on CD for free after I'm done here. Please get a copy of that. And so just a very bold man. Shocking the scholarly world in such a degree that all of the journals and publications and theological writings and books, multitudes of books from multitudes of authors were written and launched to either refute the charges or to tinker with the claims, or, it just really launched a whole new realm of scholarship directly from Lee's preliminary dissertation with Eusebius' Theophanies, simply because of its wide readership. And for Lee, it launched a very strong and long publishing career of preterist ideas. A number of these works are available online, and they're just wonderful works. Besides his extensive letters, which he writes defending his views, he had this 1843 preliminary dissertation, and then his big, huge scholarly treatment in 3 books, An Inquiry into the Nature, Progress, and End of Prophecy, a letter to G.S. Faber, the man who coined the term preterist, a dissertation on 2 Peter 3 to the Bishop of Gloucester, and then in 1851, this book here, The Events and Times of the Visions of Daniel and St. John, which is basically an encapsulated form of his preterist system, which is just an absolutely remarkable and important work. But there's a difficulty with Lee that really kind of opens up a whole new realm of thought and discussion for contemporary preterists. And especially for somebody like me who is trying to collect all of these different shades and forms within the spectrum of preterism, which really is a very wide range of different doctrines. And it becomes important for the sake of reference or for the sake of even just categorization and understanding to kind of differentiate these views, because I think all might agree here that there are some fundamental differences within that spectrum of preterism between those that see all Bible prophecy as having been fulfilled, for instance, or those that think that some was fulfilled in the past, but some is to be fulfilled in the future. I mean, there are really natural lines of delineation within this spectrum of preterism. And this is where Lee comes in, kind of opening up a new door, I think, in the approach to preterist scholarship today, in that Lee did not precisely fall, in my opinion, within the definition of full preterism, which is amazing considering his declaration that all Bible prophecy has been fulfilled. The new heavens and the new earth, the descent of the new Jerusalem, all of the book of Revelation, the resurrection, the millennium, all of that is fulfilled in the past. And yet seemingly, or at least to me, he does not comfortably fit within the category of full preterists. And the reason why is that he does not end prophetic fulfillment at AD 70, but extends it into the 4th century with the conversion and ultimate fall of pagan Roman Empire. In effect, he is he is sticking with Eusebius in this declaration that the overthrow of the nations as Christ was made the ruler of the Roman Empire was something that was contemplated in prophecy. And so, to me, it seems a very natural line of distinction there, because I think that contemporary full preterism tends to a man and woman, believe that all Bible prophecy was fulfilled by AD 70, according to verses like Luke 21 and 22. That all things will be fulfilled. And so this presents a bit of a problem and kind of motivated a bit of a shift for me at the website, in that he did not consider AD 70 to be the consummation of the ages, and so it doesn't seem to me to precisely fall within that spectrum of believing that all eschatology was fulfilled by AD 70. However, according to the Webster's definition, he does fall within that definition of preterist, which is accepted by full preterists, of a theologian who believes that all of the prophecies of the apocalypse have been fulfilled, or all the prophecies of the apocalypse, and by extension all of the others, have been fulfilled. So I personally settled the matter by differentiating full preterism from what I call modern preterism. And that's, again, not terminology for anybody else. It's just simply for the sake of categorization on the website. But here's a couple of interesting distinctions between Samuel Lee and full preterism. Looking at here the image of Nebuchadnezzar that we see in the book of Daniel, and the issue of the 4 kingdoms and then the stone kingdom that comes, Samuel Lee's position was that the feet being heathen and pagan Rome by agreement, the stone striking the feet of the statue must of necessity symbolize the destruction and fall of heathen Rome. That to make the stone hit anywhere else, but with the fall of Rome itself being the 4th kingdom, that therefore we need to look past AD 70 with the fall of Jerusalem and recognize that this prophecy, which does not specifically refer to Jerusalem or Judea or any of these things in this particular image, must in fact refer to heathen Rome and its fall. And so that was one of the main reasons why he saw the fulfillment of Bible prophecy being contemplated beyond the scope of AD 70, as it focused, he believed, on the battle between Christians and Judaism and paganism. And he saw the overthrow of Rome and the most powerful empire the world has ever seen as something that wasn't ignored by Bible prophecy, but something that very much had to do with the vindication of Jesus Christ and his exaltation over the nations. So this is Samuel Lee's view. This is something also that's very similar with a number of other, what I would call 6-seal preterists. Guys who believe that 6 of the 7 seals of Revelation have been fulfilled, but there's one more to be fulfilled. That isn't exactly the same as Samuel Lee. But this point of view, seeing the fall of heathen Rome as being the fulfillment of prophecy, is actually something that's pretty widespread, although I don't believe that it falls within the specific realm of full preterism. Again, seeing that as having reference to AD 70 and that particular generation, it just seems to me that there's a natural dividing line. The 70th week of Daniel is another area where there's a differentiation between Samuel Lee and full preterism, again going to this issue of dealing with Judaism and paganism. And he writes, the vision of the evening and the morning is true, and his comment on that. And here the establishment of Christ's kingdom is clearly foretold in Zechariah verse 9, and, i.e. in that day, the Lord shall be king over all the earth, and in that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. Both the 1 year and day is therefore divided into 2 parts. The first one, in one case, is summer, and in the second, the evening. And here's what he means. In Daniel's 70th week, the apostolic period is, as we have seen, its first portion, summer. And this constitutes the apostolical millennium. Its second portion, reaching from the fall of the city and temple to the establishment of Christianity under Constantine, these then respectively are Zechariah's summer and winter, morning and evening. And so this is an area where I believe we see a clear differentiation between Lee and what we would see as contemporary full preterism. And then he finishes, we have therefore the same period and portions of it before us in every case, and in the increasing progress of this river, a lively representation of the triumphant progress of the Gospels, most notably with the overthrow of the Roman Empire. So here's where the issue of modern preterism came in for me and the website and categorization. It's that whole spectrum of fully fulfilled eschatology. Remember, he said all Bible prophecy is fulfilled. He just puts it extending into the 4th century. But I see modern preterism to be differentiated from full in that it sees the whole spectrum of fully fulfilled eschatology, which includes full preterism, and recent systems of preterist idealism as well that do see all eschatology as fulfilled in the past, and generally believes that all eschatology was fulfilled by AD 70, as in the case of full preterism, or with pagan Rome's fall or conversion to Christianity. And so I have both of those categorized under modern preterism at the website. You're welcome to check it out, and again, it's just simply for the purposes of classification and categorization. But regardless of this difference, it doesn't make me think any less of Samuel Lee. He was a man well ahead of his time and used the absolute most with the resources he had to spread this message of prophecy fulfillment to the entire scholarly world of his day. Just an amazing impact that this man had, not only from the translations that he did, bringing the gospel to the Oriental world, but also with the theological journals, which were then focused wholeheartedly on issues of fulfillment of eschatology immediately following the publication of Lee's works. But there's also this sense that Lee had an amazing impact upon the theologians that surrounded him at the same time and in that day. And James Stuart Russell is one of those that was almost certainly aware of Lee's preterist system. Their professional lives overlapped by at least 5 years in the same town, and Russell was only 30 miles away from Lee at Cambridge during that time. And also, Russell attended Chestnut College in Samuel Lee's home district of Hertfordshire and was quite likely a close observer of Lee, if not an apprentice of some sort, either personally or through literature. But one thing's for sure, that direct connection has not been made as a matter of fact, but one thing's for sure is that Lee became a source of massive scorn by coming out with this system of completely fulfilled eschatology. And as a result of this, it may be one reason why Russell published his work anonymously. That's just completely a theory. But if there wasn't a negative connotation to the view of fulfilled prophecy, then there just doesn't seem to be a reason to publish anonymously. And this might be one reason, because of the work of Samuel Lee and the immense scorn that came as a result of it. Maybe other reasons as well. But there's somebody else that was quite profoundly affected by Samuel Lee, the earliest known modern preterist at this point. There was a pastor in the city of Liverpool, up in the northern part of the country, who, as a result of studies based upon Samuel Lee's writings, penned what is the earliest known, undeniably full preterist book. Just keeps getting better and better here. A past event from 1845. In this book, he has a number of tinkerings, a number of perfecting of Lee's work. He interacts with Lee quite a bit in this and points out a number of potential inconsistencies, or at least inconsistencies according to Townley, that he believed could be taken care of by a more consistent approach, which saw the fulfillment of all Bible prophecy by AD 70 in particular. And absolutely, Luke 21:22 was mentioned as one of those reasons why the Scripture limits the scope of the fulfillment of all prophecy, not just to the 4th century, but AD 70 itself. And even as a result of this is very convinced that what he has come up with is the absolute truth. He writes, "There is not a shadow of a shade of error in the conclusion at which I have arrived." Just a very bold statement from Robert Townley. I've got to appreciate that. Some of the quotes from this book, I'll run through them real fast. "We conceive to be the scriptural doctrine of the millennium as confined to the period of the apostolic ministry. Now the resurrection being part and parcel of that preaching of the gospel to which the promise was made, lo, I am with you always, even to the consummation of the age. Therefore the resurrection must be limited by the same consummation of the age, and must consequently be past, the apostolic age and ministry being now no longer visible, and the promise of Christ being now of none effect, having been fulfilled. And again, the Lord God at the destruction of Jerusalem made his foes his footstool. He completely abolished death, of whom it is said in 1 Corinthians 15, death, the last enemy, is disabled. He took away entirely the first covenant, which was the ministration of death, that he might establish supremely the second, which was the ministration of life," and talks about the shaking of those things and applying those to the burning up of the Mosaic economy. So pretty good stuff, isn't it? I mean, this is a wonderful find. I actually have to give credit to Scott Thompson, who did a wonderful job of finding this and then passing it on to me. The earliest known full preterist book from 1845, predating the previously known by over 100 years. So that right there is an amazing step forward, I believe, in the history of full preterist scholarship, to have finally been able to break through to the 19th century with a very developed and very contemporary view of full preterism. And Townley was influenced by Lee. He said things like, would that Professor Lee's works form part of a prescribed course of reading for ordination candidates. He loved his work, there's no question. And he wrote, I will take the liberty of transcribing one or two passages respecting the fall of Jerusalem in order to show the correspondency between his view of the fulfillment of prophecy and my own. We prove, and Dr. Lee admits, that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ. Consequently, the prediction must have been fulfilled. So we have a direct connection here between Lee and Townley in the creation of his work. And Townley is also very, I think, relevant for today's studies within kind of the shop talk, I guess, within the full preterist movement itself. As he addresses the doctrines of universalism, he addresses a number of different doctrines that are being currently discussed right now in full preterist circles, such as a global versus local flood and all of these types of issue. But one that he focused on a lot in his book was the doctrines of universalism, which in the 19th century really gained an ascendancy in his country and in America too. And his target was Dr. David Thom of Liverpool, within the same town that he lived in. And he attacked Dr. Thom in one of his footnotes in the back, an entire section that was focused on attacking Dr. Thom and his universalism, writing about that universalism was, quote, a conclusion as preposterous, or this conclusion was as preposterous as the universalism which rests for support on passages like that out of Corinthians, wherein the apostle is discoursing of none but the church, vis-a-vis, as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And so he's interacting and attempting to refute universalism in his book, this same earliest known full preterist book. And he writes, if I'm to be a believer in universalism, I must have a widely different statement from any which Mr. T, Dr. Thom, propounds. He says, I respect Mr. Thom as a man of very superior mental attainments and have pleasure in conversing with him or hearing him converse on any subject save and except his imaginary biblical conclusions. But this also, I think, kind of brings up Townley's difficulties. And this is something where it takes a great deal of research and digging and prying, basically through every word of these works, which is really where the time-consuming process of publishing these books and categorizing them online comes in, is really figuring out down to every crossed T and dotted I where it does fall. And as I wrote, Townley was involved in many controversies, eternal punishment, global flood, judgment in AD 70, and universalism that were very widespread in England in the 19th century. But there was a very curious endorsement of Townley's book that kind of piqued my interest and raised an eyebrow and suggested the need for a little bit more digging into the story of Robert Townley. And here's a picture of Townley right here, from the 19th century, acquired from Harvard University Divinity School. And that curious endorsement was from the collection of the Universalist Historical Society. And at first my thinking was, well, this is probably because of his interaction with Dr. Thom that this work was collected, much like a full preterist will have, like a Keith Matheson book in his library or something like this. But it still required a little bit more digging in the person of Robert Townley and his subsequent publishing as well. And what it brought up was a very interesting connection by him and Dr. Thom. Here's a picture of Berean Universalist Church, which was the actual parish of Dr. Thom, closed in 1975. And it turns out that Townley was actually converted to Universalism by this same Dr. David Thom. So the earliest known full preterist converted to Universalism shortly after the publishing of his book. And here's some references to that and to the work that took place. Actually, here is a reference to Dr. Thom from the New York Tribune, which called him a man of no ordinary character, settled as a pastor of an independent congregation in Liverpool, is widely known by his published writings, as well as respected for his learning, ability, and piety. And so it was this man that converted Robert Townley to Universalism. And so it, which we will see right here, came as a result of some information that I was able to acquire regarding Townley. But the question came up to me, why was he converted? I mean, it was an unfortunate situation, at least from my point of view, having a particular distaste for that form of doctrine, to see that this discovery kind of went awry a little bit, that it wasn't quite necessarily the victory that I had hoped it would be, I guess, in that the first things outweighing, in my opinion, the last things, kind of made it take on a different life. But one thing that as a result of the perusal of Townley's works, that kind of provided a clue maybe into why it was so easy for him to be converted to universalism immediately after the publishing of this book, was in his developed consistent cessationism. And this is something that, to me, is kind of a clue for how he might have been led somewhere. And this consistent cessationism is something that's quite popular today, and I'm not trying to disparage anybody that holds to it. It's this issue of trying to find the most consistent form of full preterism. I can absolutely appreciate the desire to come to the most consistent form of a system of doctrine that you can, but I think that there's a lot of dangers in that, possibly, especially as we begin to pile assumptions one upon another, such as in the case where Townley wrote in his book, if at the destruction of Jerusalem there was the taking away of the first covenant, a removal of the old heaven and earth, a burning up of the same, if sins, Satan, death, and hell have had their true and scriptural meaning in reference only to the two covenants of Sinai and Sidon, as consequent upon the Adamic transgression, and proof to the contrary is defied, if these things be so, then we are warranted in concluding. And to me, this kind of raised a little bit of a red flag. I mean, anytime that you have so much riding upon such a mound of presumptions, I think to me it kind of it's begging for difficulties. And in this particular case of Townley, there were other quotes that I found that show this developed, consistent cessationism, such as, and this is his quote, "We object to the entire constitution of the various religious establishments of the day because we believe that they all maintain the great foundation principle of Judaism, that is, the outward and visible church." And so he was consistent in his cessation of everything, including the church and moron, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line, developing an incredibly consistent form of full preterism in that respect. He also writes things such as, "This was the originating cause of trouble then, from the man of sin, Antichrist, flesh, the carnal mind, which was attached to the law, whose strength was sin, which was the sting of death, the wages of sin, of which death the devil had the power. At the same destruction of Jerusalem, all these, the enemies, were put under Christ's feet, the fall of Jerusalem being, in his own words, our authority, most indisputably his second coming to reward every man according to his works." And so what I'm getting at here is that this seems to me to be an issue where Dr. Tom would have been able to sit Townley down face to face and say, well, listen, if you believe that all of these things were done away in AD 70, if you believe that sin was done away, that the Antichrist was done away, and flesh and the carnal mind, because they were all attached to the law, and sin even, which was the sting of death, the wages of sin, all of which separate people from God, then how can you consistently say that today, in your new heavens and new earth, and in your age to come, there is sin, and there is death, and there is devil, and all of these things? And so there's these issues that Dr. Tom, whether it was this or other particular issues, but from my research, that is the most likely area, having also read Dr. Tom's works, which are likewise available on that disc at the back. But what's interesting is that Tom was cognizant of Townley's extreme, let me choose a different word, his very full view of preterism. I mean, Tom himself was a partial preterist, but absolutely recognized how critical to Townley's doctrine was this view of complete fulfillment by AD 70, that there was something that seemed natural to Townley, and that was to send, to Tom, and that was to send Townley to America, and to Boston in particular, and that's exactly what happened. I have the actual letter here that Dr. Tom sent with Townley, so that when he came and arrived in Boston, he could deliver to the Universalist churches in that area. And in this letter from Dr. Tom, he talks about how, quote, "Townley has recently been satisfied of the truth of God's universal love to man in Jesus Christ," and gives this letter as a way of introduction. And immediately, Robert Townley, this author of the earliest known full preterist book, became a pastor of the First Universalist Church in Boston, Massachusetts. by, again, the endorsement of Dr. Tom. And Dr. Tom, recognizing it, again, like I said, this preterism, writes in his book, by some, the apocalypse is considered to have received its accomplishment and at the period of Jerusalem's destruction. Among the American Universalists, this view is very prevalent. And so that provided another lead for me personally to try and get to the bottom of this story, because as uncomfortable as I am from Universalism, I don't like to see such a close connection, but the more I dug, the more that connection tightened, including, and specifically this reference from Tom, that among the American Universalists, it was very prevalent to teach that the apocalypse was accomplished at the destruction of Jerusalem. So it became possible that the earliest full preterist book might yet be discovered, but it would be discovered amongst the ranks of American Universalists, and that was a very real possibility, because there was an amazing movement of American preterist universalism taking place in Boston and the entire New England area. These same people who were dealing with the issues of the coming of the Son of Man, endless punishment, annihilationism, the global deluge, and universal salvation was just absolutely going throughout all the churches in that area. In fact, I've seen references that all the churches in Boston were Unitarian of a Universalist sort. Now, that's certainly hyperbole, but the point being that between Unitarians, Universalists, and Congregationalists in New England, this form of Universalism, particularly preterist Universalism, was very prevalent. Ralph Waldo Emerson is one of those that was a Unitarian and a Universalist in this regard. An American essayist, you may be familiar with the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was in Boston and brought the Unitarian message to Harvard in 1837. And the reason I bring up Emerson here is that it reminds me of one of his quotes. And one of the quotes of Emerson is that the easiest way to lose a person is by death. And that's a really relevant comment, I think, in this regard, because Townley was kind of like a lost child, just a real shame to see this man lost to, in my view, this distasteful doctrine. And I'm certainly aware that a great number of people hold to this view. Preterist Universalism is clearly on the ascendant, and there might even be Universalists or Unitarians in the group today. Please don't take this as any type of personal attack on your character or integrity. I'm just trying to represent my own point of view as faithfully as I can. But one thing that's interesting in the digging about these American preterist Universalists is that they did view the second coming of Christ and the book of Revelation and all of these things fulfilled in regards to the judgment of the Jews in AD 70, seeing that the judgment of the Jews in AD 70 satisfied all of God's wrath, and that from that point forward, God was at total peace with mankind. And so I just want to pause for a second and just reiterate that point, that this earliest known full preterist author, converted to Universalism in Liverpool, England, was sent to America to pastor the first Universalist church in Boston and become one of the leaders of the American preterist Universalist movement that was taking place in New England at that time. And in the First Universalist Church of Boston, Townley became the co-minister with a man by the name of Balfour, who's a similar case to Townley, started out a Calvinist and became convinced of universalism by a preterist. And it was as a result of the preterist arguments that he heard that he converted from Calvinism to universalism. And here's a couple of quotes by Townley's co-minister, Balfour. The Old Testament, he thinks, speaking of this preterist that he was converted by, makes Gehenna an emblem of the future temporal punishment to the Jews as a nation. With this clue, he comes to the New Testament and interprets all such passages as Matthew 24:33, "Ye generation of vipers, how shall ye escape the damnation of hell?" as of the temporal calamities connected with the fall of Jerusalem. I deemed universalism a great error, sometimes discussed the subject with Universalists, and always thought had the best of the argument. The first thing which staggered my faith in the doctrine of endless punishment was reading Mr. Stewart's letters. His statements I was unable to controvert, and the text of which they were founded upon seemed to support them. And so it was Mr. Stewart that converted Balfour to Universalism as a result of his arguments. And this Mr. Stewart is none other than Moses Stewart, a man who many might be very familiar with his writings, his commentary on the Apocalypse, which is one of the great preterist commentaries on the book of Revelation, a historical preterist, a partial preterist, but just an unbelievably influential man in his day. And here's a quote from Professor Stewart. Here then, on the very front of the book, The Apocalypse, is exhibited a title page indicative of the contents of the work. The punishment of the unbelieving and persecuting Jews must follow the coming of the Lord. And this is one leading object of the book to illustrate and confirm. In other words, that Revelation 1:1, 1:3, shortly come to pass, is the context through which the entire rest of the book of Revelation needs to be read and understood. And then Balfour says, these declarations, remarkable, coming from such a source, a man greatly renowned in America, considered the first great American scholar, at once arrested Mr. Balfour's attention. He was greatly perplexed, and in his perplexity turned to Professor Stewart for support. And so, according to Balfour, it was Stewart's preterism that lent themselves to Balfour to lead him into a consistent preterist universalist view. And he writes, and I'll try and get through this quickly, to Mr. Stewart of Andover, I am indebted for making me a universalist, and to him the world are indebted for my books. If I have embraced an error and have published it to the world, let all who think so know that he is the man who led me astray, who was urged to give some explanation but declined it, and that nothing has been said by him or any other person to show me my error. But led by his investigations to see that not of the words translated hell in the Bible has any reference to a place of future punishment. And then here's an interesting comment that really shows the connection between these two men and preterism and universalism in America in the 19th century. And it's called, referred to as an unauthorized or fanciful thought. It turns out that in the orderings of providence, our venerable and excellent Father was so first called among the immortals, meaning Balfour, that he might welcome there his equally venerable and excelled peer, meaning Stewart, with whom he had been so much in debate, to reciprocate his offices of help by introducing to him, Stewart, into the larger and clearer displays of grace and truth, which were to settle all their controversies and demonstrate the glory of God as the Father and the efficiency of Christ as the Redeemer of all souls. Turns out that Stewart died the very day after Balfour, and the preterist universalists took this as a sign that the two of them were very close and were actually close in their theology and close in their relationship, and that that relationship would continue into the eternal realm. So all very interesting studies that came out of the research in Google Books and other places. John Humphrey Noyes, a historical preterist, in his work, The Berean, writes, if an angel from heaven bearing the seals of 10,000 miracles should establish a religion which should fail to recognize the truth which blazes on the whole front of the New Testament, that Jesus Christ came the second time at the destruction of Jerusalem, I would call him an impostor. A very strong preterist statement from this man, Noyes, who likewise said, in relation to the judgment, we agree with the universalists that the second coming of Christ took place in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is 1847. Going back a little bit earlier now, seeing that there is a direct connection being made in scholarship between preterism and universalism, and that in fact it is the universalists that are introducing preterism to the scholarly world at large in America, in New England. And this goes farther back yet. Remember Ephraim Currier, our poor mixed-up friend from earlier, who saw a full preterist view of the Jews and a full futurist view of the Gentiles, but who gave us a delightful work called The Second Coming of Christ and the Resurrection. Likewise had something to say. In 1841 he wrote, about the year 1824, some books which from Universalist authors fell my way, which I read with much pleasure. And by comparing the sentiments therein contained with the Bible, I was rejoiced to find that the sentiments of that sect appeared much more scriptural as well as reasonable than the sentiments of limitarians. I soon became a confirmed Universalist. And out of that confirmation in the Universalist view came his subsequent studies, including a change of soteriology and ultimately this book, which endorsed this partially full preterist view. Anyway, this comment from 1841 looks back to 1824. and the preterist arguments of universalists at that time. In 1860, Erasmus Manford, in an oral debate with Benjamin Franklin, not the same, wrote, "I have proved beyond all doubt that my friend does not believe that sinners of our day will ever be judged or punished." He was against universalism. "Not even by the lashing of conscience, for the coming of Christ to judge the world was all fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem. And since that time there has been no hell, judgment, or punishment of any kind for the ungodly, and never will be." So again, not only are we seeing a close relationship between preterism and universalism, we're seeing the preterism of the coming of Christ in AD 70 as the fundamental proof for the universalist point of view, which is another matter entirely, showing not only a close correlation, but an absolute unity of thought between these two views. In 1842, Benjamin Fisk Barrett, in his work A Course of Lectures on the Doctrine of the New Jerusalem Church, wrote, "This theory limits the prophecy under consideration, the second coming, to the overthrow of the Jewish capital and the downfall of Judaism. Consequently, when Jerusalem was destroyed some 30 or 40 years after the prediction, it was then fulfilled in the sense in which the Lord intended it. This is the way that those who call themselves Unitarians and Universalists commonly interpret this passage." So again, just all over the place. I could go on and on. There's a couple more, but throughout Google Books in particular, just an unbelievable avalanche of preterist universalism in the early part of the 19th century, out of which we see the development of more developed forms of preterism, and even the emergence of full preterism by a man who then converted to universalism, seeing a connection between the two. Benjamin Halleck, in 1840, writing against universalism, wrote, "Having shown that the coming of Christ took place as he had stated during that generation, it must have been at that time that the wicked, those on the left hand, the goats, or the unbelieving Jews, went away to this punishment. By consulting the prophets, it may be seen that great temporal judgments and national calamities and punishments are spoken of under the figure of a fire that shall not be quenched, as becoming an everlasting reproach. Our blessed Lord, it would seem, attached more importance to the fact that his coming in his kingdom was to take place during that generation, while some of the hearers would be living witnesses of it, than he did to any other circumstance connected with this event." And this is him commenting against Reverend E.F. Hatfield and his preterist universalism, dating now back to 1840. In 1836, Luther Lee, Universalism Examined and Refuted, wrote, "The judgment and, of course, the punishment of the wicked are connected with the second coming of Christ. The Universalists maintain that was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem, while anti-Universalists consider it descriptive of a future and general judgment. Universalists explain Matthew 24 by the preceding chapter, which treats the destruction of Jerusalem, and where Christ says, verse 34, 'This generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled.' So even in 1836, we see that it was the common interpretation of the Universalists that the second coming of Christ took place in AD 70, and a whole host of other doctrines that contemporary full preterism hold to. But all the way back in 1811, we have discovered the writings of the father of American Universalism, the man who united the Unitarians and Universalists, who are still a very tight connection to this day of both Unitarians and Universalists. There's differences between the two, but the best explanation I've heard differentiating Unitarians and Universalists is that the Universalists say that God is too good to condemn man, whereas the Unitarians say that man is too good to be condemned by God. And so we've got these two different sides of the same doctrine that brought the Unitarians and Universalists together. But this father of American Universalism in 1811 wrote, "If Christ is to be understood as he said, if his words explain his meaning, it is clear that his coming in his glory was sometime in the lifetime of those to whom he spake. If this be true, which my opponent with his eyes open will not dispute, then no objection can be stated from this parable against the final holiness and happiness of all men. We are informed that Christ came once in the end of the world to put away sin. The world of which Christ came in the end was undoubtedly the dispensation of the legal priesthood." So in the very fundamental documents of American Universalism and Unitarian Universalism, we see this preterist argument being used as a fundamental proof of the position. And it goes back even farther. In 1805, Hosea Ballou wrote, in Matthew 12, 31 and 32, "Neither in this world nor in that which is to come." World means dispensation. This world, the legal priestly dispensation, and that which is to come, the gospel. "Nothing can be more evident than that what Jesus and his disciples meant by the end of the world was the end of the Jewish polity and their destruction by the Romans. The wrath to come of which John spake when he said, "Who hath warned you?" is speaking of the destruction of the Jews and their city, for he said, "For these are the days of vengeance, that all these things which are written may be fulfilled." So again, we see the fundamental origins of preterist universalism, or even American universalism, coming through the doctrines of what is called by many full preterism. Keith Matheson is one who would consider Hosea Ballou, this father of American universalism, a full preterist based upon his definition of the view. Now, according to mine, which the websites, which is All Prophecy by 8070, Hosea Ballou would not classify, but my definition is by no means the most popular, and therefore it is very likely that in subsequent days and months and years that the earliest full preterist known will be considered to be Hosea Ballou, the father of American universalism, which is a very real likelihood. And there are many other preterist universalist works that I didn't take the time to either study or cite, but which seem to be really good references to the preterism of it. J.T. Flanders, A Review of Universalism Against Itself. Thomas Brown, A History of the Origin and Progress of the Doctrine of Universal Salvation, 1826. And then there's various cited in the 1825 book, A Defense of Orthodoxy Against the Heresy of Universalism. There's also Ephraim Currier talking about the books from 1824 that fell his way. And then also there's a number of Universalist books cited by Ed Stevens here in the bibliography of his book, What Happened in AD 70. So a number of other early preterist Universalists that have been cited and yet really haven't been mined to find out really how far back it goes. But there's potential there at any rate. But one thing really I want to do with this is not try and say that consistent preterism is universalism. That's not my purpose, nor is it to try and defame full preterism or provide ammunition against full preterism, although I'm sorry to say that I'm absolutely compelled to publish this material on the website immediately. I've actually withheld the publishing of this material until it could be presented at this conference. Because I know that once it is published, it's going to be really kind of a whole new realm of defense, as I believe that a number of people will focus on this and try and unite full preterism absolutely with universalism. So I just want to let you know as kind of fair warning that this is about to be published on the website and the books as well. But you can also get the books in preparation for whatever defenses might need to be done. They're available on the CDs in the back, and as soon as we're done here, please get a free copy of those CDs. It has most of these works that I've cited on the CD so that you can take it home and you can study it out for yourself and do your own research, including that 1805 book by Hosea Ballou. But one thing I do want to point out is that full preterism today, besides this new sense of a turning point with discovering the earliest known full preterist book and potentially the earliest full preterist who's the father of American universalism, is kind of point out that that this, I think, probably highlights something that's really important for not only ministry leaders and authors to pay attention to, but also individual full preterists to recognize that there's an amazing diversity coming out of all denominations into the movement of full preterism. And even sitting here today, there's really a wide assortment of points of view and denominations and views of last things and views of first things. And so it's a blessing, really, to have people that we can unite with and fellowship with, coming out of complete isolation in many cases. And even with the internet, there really is this feeling of complete isolation that we can have, especially if we are either kicked out of churches because of full preterist beliefs, or don't feel a clear conscience of being able to sit in a futurist church, either because of the idea that silence is consent or having to sign some statement of faith. And so the isolating effects of full preterism and this amazing diversity coming out of all denominations is really a tension that has started to kind of bubble up a little bit, especially on the internet and in chat groups and in areas where these differentiating point of views are kind of coming at loggerheads against each other, and people are kind of banging heads. Because I think that we need to recognize that this is what at least before we had asked for, or those who were in positions of leadership or with websites or literature, that we really wanted people to come out of all denominations. And I think that full preterists still do want people to come out of all denominations and backgrounds into the realization of fulfilled prophecy. But that being the case, and recognizing really how different these points of view are, particularly if we're going to talk about the view of universal salvation versus limited atonement, I mean, this is really an amazing difference here in a real sense, kind of irreconcilable differences between these two views, regardless of any other agreements. And so one thing I just wanted to do really fast is just from my own perspective of having observed the preterist movement for over a decade, and now having discovered these earlier roots, really try and maybe offer some hope for healing or a way of moving forward that's profitable and not negative in the sense of always bickering between these differentiating views or cutting one another down or insisting that our view be accepted as the view that the entire movement accepts, and these types of points of view, with the thought of thinking whether or not it's possible to sculpt one unified body in the full preterist movement. Because I think that maybe that's the hope that has been held out, that it is very possible and very likely, if not the actual reality, that there is one unified body within the movement. But it's really just not the case. And out of a desire to avoid these tensions that are bubbling up right now and find ways to deal with that and to come to some third way, if you will, of dealing with this that isn't either establishment or opposition banging each other and with the carnage that results from that, but trying to find a third way which recognizes that there's not going to be a monolithic movement of, let's say, Reformed preterists that takes over the face of American Christianity, or preterist universalists, as some believe that there will be a unified movement under preterist universalism as there was in the past. And so these are issues that need to be addressed while looking specifically at the issue of whether continually dividing from one another is really the best answer. Because observing things for over a decade now, it's really become clear that division is the easiest option. It really is. When it comes to a controversy to where two people's pride come against each other, it really kind of seems easier to just turn away, to walk away and never look back again, to just either ignore or divide from a person, giving them up to Satan for the destruction of the flesh or whatever it might be, over, in some cases, the most minute of disagreements on tertiary issues of doctrine. And so I think it's probably now the necessary time, kind of looking ahead now with the publishing of these materials, for a measured approach, or at least to begin thinking about a measured approach of how to move forward now with this new environment. I think one is having realistic expectations, and that is, what does the Lord teach us through change, not only in our doctrine but in our lives? And one thing I want to bring up is that with the isolation as profound as it is from the world, just because of the eschatology, when we begin to just assume that division is the best answer, then we find that our isolation becomes more profound indeed. And we do have to learn how to stand alone in Christ, but do we have to say it's going to be us three and no others, us four and no more, as the old Baptist saying goes, I guess? Is that really the best answer? Because full preterist fellowship is very rare, as we know, and even on the internet it is. And one thing with this realistic expectation of seeing that it's not going to be a monolithic movement of either preterist universalist or Reformed preterists or Church of Christ or apostolic preterists or all these very divergent points of view, is that we don't put too much faith in the movement or in the community, that we really do find a measure of grace with those who disagree with us and not find ourselves crushed because those that we previously believed were brothers actually hold to a different view of the immortal body at death, view of the resurrection. So these are just considerations, recognizing that there's not going to be, and there isn't and hasn't been, a united Reformation to join or to serve, and there's no public vindication really that's forthcoming in any short-term expectation for the preterist movement. I mean, all of these ideas just to limit the disappointment, to limit kind of the broken hearts and the crushed feelings that we might get if we have this magical thinking of this preterist takeover of the scholarly world, which is fun enough to think about maybe 500 years down the road or something. But if we're basing our own sense of personal worth upon this vindication, then I'm afraid we're going to die broken people like Ephraim Currier did. And so important considerations, especially with the influx of curious doctrines continuing in full preterism. And by no means have we seen the worst that there is to offer, I believe. As much as I do not like universalism, there is much worse coming down the road. And so, these are all considerations. And I think probably the natural next question is, well, with whom do we separate then? There's strange winds of doctrine in every movement. This is shop talk for full preterism, but that doesn't mean it's limited to full preterism. But the very real question is, from who do we separate? Paul himself said, from such withdraw yourself. So when I talk about unity, do not think that I'm saying that we do not separate. That is my heritage as a Baptist, recognizing that separation is a very important part of the person of God, that justice and righteousness are both the exact same word. And so don't misunderstand where I'm getting at here. But I think we need to investigate very carefully what is being said and written from all corners of this or any movement, like I'm having to do with these old books. Really take the time to anybody that we're going to either support or follow or whatever, even though all of that's questionable to, say, be a disciple of a person. But I think regardless of that, we need to be very careful about what is said and written, because we may have somebody that we are next to on issues of AD 70 that otherwise we probably might not feel comfortable being in unity with. These are just considerations. And so I think researching these viewpoints, and researching them fairly, by the way, is very important. Not coming to any knee-jerk reactions, not listening to them long enough to refute them, or any of these tactics which are kind of corners that are cut. I think now is really the time, the critical time, to not cut these corners, but to really take the time to determine whether or not full preterism itself is the primary determining factor for fellowship, or if there's something else. Because with satisfaction of first things, I think that our spiritual walk will be strong enough and better prepared to deal with these last things. And that instead of looking at our last things, the second coming of Christ in AD 70, as being the sole determining factor of unity, that maybe it's time to be a little bit more persistent about it and start to really turn to the first things and maybe bring those things into consideration as we determine who to fellowship with. And something else that I think is worthy of bringing up is this issue of fellowshipping with futurists who we hold a like soteriological or first things view with. Must we agree with every church 100%? Some are forsaking assembling altogether based upon these last things with men and women they absolutely are in lockstep agreement with on the primary first things. And so this sense of theological nationalism is lonely, and I'm seeing it destroy people's peace. I'm seeing it destroy their rest. I'm seeing it destroy their marriages. And in some cases, I'm even seeing it come close to destroying lives. And so it's far time to address these issues. And so as important keys for finding peace and rest, I think we need to reconsider our fellowship with futurist, like-minded Christians, that if we can find an assembly with a loving nature that focuses on Jesus Christ, then we might be able to look past some of the other ends. It'll help minimize the damage that is happening. It'll tear down the walls we built and the moats we've dug with people that are our brothers and sisters who just simply happen to hold a different view of eschatology. And so, number 4 I've got here is division the effect. What is the effect of this wrong basis of fellowship? And it's division. I mean, just really quickly, I'd like to look at this and see how by fellowshipping in last things, we really are encouraging division and destruction. Because what's more important and what defines your faith is that Jesus Christ came in AD 70, or that salvation in Him is determined by grace through faith. What defines who you are? The last things, I believe, tend towards disappointment, and it contributes to greater isolation. And I believe we should consider finding first things fellowship, regardless of last things differences. And I think also that ministers and authors and preachers and website people and whoever should really consider the idea of narrowing their ends things evangelism to first things like-minded people. I'm going to get into this really quickly. I know I'm probably right at the end here, but please just consider this, that by focusing on last things as the basis of our fellowship, we are actually not only creating divisions by coming together under AD 70. First of all, we've lost all the futurists, but then all of a sudden we lose those who differ on resurrection or atonement or cessation, with Christ as secondary and AD 70 as primary. But we can find unity in Christ with Christ as primary and AD 70 as secondary, Calvinists and Arminians, futurists and preterists. There's neither dispensationalist nor full preterist in Christ. There really isn't. But this is also something that I believe ministers and authors need to take into consideration, is that this tail-wagging dog approach is counterproductive even to their goals. In that, by focusing on last things, they themselves are contributing to the rise of what they would consider to be heresies within full preterism. That not having established any firm basis or soundness in first things, what do we expect? Except that people, as they go through consistency in last things, find themselves shooting off into areas that we might consider heresy, including atheism altogether, which does happen actually quite a bit. But if our soteriology is really our ministry focus with AD 70 as secondary, we can minister to everybody. Everybody can be ministered to in a unified basis in first things. Maybe you can't find unity with a Universalist. Maybe you can't find it with an Arminian. I know many Calvinists that can find no fellowship with Calvinists. They withdraw themselves and divide. Those are things that your conscience is going to have to minister to you through the Spirit about. And so with this new history that has come up and kind of the marginalization of these other pocket forms of full preterism, including Reformed full preterism, the question becomes, what is this movement? What is the establishment? What is being built? By whom and for whom? Because there's no stopping or marginalizing preterist universalism now. That's the thing that really hit me in the face as a result of these studies, is that if anybody has the mantle, then it's this particular point of view. And like I mentioned, I believe there's much worse positions yet to come, especially if there comes a day when full preterism sells. If Hank Hanegraaff can prove that preterism sells, we can watch the wolves coming in. You'll be able to see them coming in by the truckloads just so they can sell a book, with no regard for either really last things or first things. And so, the question is, how do we deal with it? Do we deny that it exists? Do we ignore it? Do we filibuster it? Do we viciously attack it and declare them non-Christians? These are all questions that need to be asked, especially asking who's glorified by these things. If the fruits of the flesh are the manifestation of our method in Christ, what does that glorify and what does that teach to those that are looking in? I mean, we've seen, haven't we, that our fellowship isn't based in last things. I believe that point has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt because of the amazing disharmony and disunity, just like any other group, but in this group as well. And this again brings up to this idea of restricting end things evangelism to like-minded people, to those that are our brothers that we can have fellowship with, regardless of who those might be, so that we don't result in the actual creation of who we would consider heretics. But the question also arises, and this is kind of what I'm closing with, are disagreements that we have just details? Are they just disagreements? Are they, just differences of opinion? Or do we believe that this Calvinism, for instance, is an overthrow of Christianity, or this Arminianism is an absolute overthrow of the gospel, or this Universalism is absolutely, or this dispensationalism is absolutely a different religion? Those are very honest questions, I believe, and each of us has got to answer those for ourselves. But one thing I'd like to bring out of this is that for those particularly people in leadership positions, I believe that they need to clearly define these lines. That if we believe something is an overthrow, I believe it should be declared such. I think, and this is just me personally, that all of these hybrids of full preterism should come forward and really make plain this version of full preterism. Now that the spectrum is so wide and everybody's coming out of all the denominations, we should clearly define, I believe, if we're in leadership positions, if we're talking about preterist universalism, if we're talking about reformed preterism or preterist idealism or whatever it might be, and clearly define these hybrids, but also clearly define what we believe to be a hyper preterism. And this is something that's very controversial. This year, this is my goal for the website at Preterist Archive, is to define hyper-preterism. I've got one on there that's kind of a stopgap definition right now, but I hope to kind of specify more in the coming months, because this definition of hyper-preterism is very important, not only for the good of followers and the movement, but also the observers on the outside that are looking in that say, well, these people have no boundaries or limits. Anybody's welcome to just come in and be welcomed with open arms, regardless if they're Universalist or Arminian or whatever. The question is, can fulfillment be taken too far? And I think that most full preterists might say that it does, such in the case of saying that the gospel ceased in AD 70, or that the Bible was only about the Jews and with the fulfillment to them, it's not the book for us today, or any of these number of different areas where we might believe that there is a hyper-preterism. Because to deny that there is a hyper-preterism, I believe, encourages critical errors, the creation of heretics, and discourages those who are investigating preterism. And so the question is, are all winds of doctrine, so long as they're full preterist, simply legitimate alternatives? And I believe the hyper label needs to be given, especially and without reservation by all leaders and authors, that it's shown that there are not just other options. And right now this discussion needs to be brought into the open and also in literary production. I've done some research to find full preterist definitions of hyper-preterism, and besides my own, I've only found 3. Among all the literature of full preterism, I've only found 3 definitions, and I have to very much take my hats off to those 3 who have taken the time to do this. Ward Fenley defined hyper-preterism as the belief that all soteriological events were consummated and ended by AD 70, and that none of the soteriological or first things benefits of Christ's redemptive work apply post AD 70. Mike Sullivan wrote, hyper-preterism is the literal rapture view, and no application of eternal life post AD 70. Our own Ed Stevens, I must commend for having given the most specific definition, highly to be commended. Hyper-preterists are those folks who see the church as a temporary transitional phase of the kingdom, with its phase out in AD 70. These folks would also see baptism, the Lord's Supper, and other such physical expressions of our ongoing covenant relationship with God as being no longer valid in the post-70 kingdom. This is certainly an extreme hyper-preterist position, and very few have taken that route. And the one that I've got right now on the website says that it's a very